Hi, my name is Hannan Fakhri, and my presentation today will be on how we can clean up our ecosystem through proper volunteer management. I worked with Seattle Recreative for my internship, and my site supervisor was Jenna Boitano, with my faculty advisor being Lauren Brohan. So let's move into the background of my internship. Overall, in Seattle in our neighborhood, large amounts of reusable materials enter the waste stream daily, meaning that materials that can be given a new life can be reused or then just thrown away and discarded forever. And nonprofit organizations like Seattle Recreative rely heavily on volunteers to divert the waste and to increase supply capacity in their store. However, inconsistent volunteer coordination limits their donation processing capacity and leads to slower amounts of donations and increasing store capacity to the point where they just can't take in any more donations. Therefore, my project investigates how volunteer management systems can improve reuse operations, which I will move your attention to figure one, which is an inverted hierarchy of waste management moving from top to bottom, with dispose being the last option that you would choose. You would want to prevent materials from being discarded, and then you could reuse them. Then you can recycle them, or at least try and recover them and recycle them, or just throw them into the waste stream or in the landfill. My research question for my internship is what can reuse organizations do to better their volunteer management in order to improve operations with reusable materials? And for my internship and my methods, during winter of 2026, I interned at Seattle Recreative, where I was asked to implement a more efficient volunteering system. And I used three main goals to answer this research question. The first being I observed the natural state of the environment of the store. Um, that means that before I performed any tasks, I just looked at what the workers were doing, what the volunteers were doing, how they would complete their tasks, and how the overall communication went between staff and volunteer and customer. Then I interviewed staff and volunteers to understand where the disconnect was. And then finally, I engaged in a few volunteer tasks before I created the necessary documentation. And this is an example of figure two, where one of the tasks that I did was I organized push pins and tacks into pill bottles, which increased donation capacity by organizing the push pins without having them being just in a random spot of the store, and they would ask volunteers to perform this task with almost so many different items. It doesn't have to be just push pins. And then the finalized result, the pill bottle that's filled with push pins would be sold in the store at their store floor for customers. And as for my results, I started with the problems and what needed to be changed. Through my direct observation methods, I found that donations were not organized as fast as they needed to be, and that led to delays in items being brought onto the store floor. The issue was clear, and efficient volunteer documentation was missing, and this means that the volunteers didn't have proper documentation to rely on, so that led to miscommunication between them and their staff. Another form of data that I received was interview responses, and I created a few examples that I wanted to share. One staff member from Seattle Recreative stated that it's very important that the volunteers feel valued, and we don't want the volunteers to overwhelm themselves. Another quote from a volunteer is, I feel that communication with long-term volunteers is often lacking. And then finally, a Seattle Recreative staff member stated that there is not much of a process and that there should be a we need this done mindset. So I took all of these interview responses and I overall we found a solution. So what was done in the end? In the end of my internship, I created these two volunteer task binders, which are exactly the same, but the only difference is their cover and the location where they would stay. One of the locations is Georgetown, which is where one of the Seattle Recreative stores are, and then the other one is in Greenwood. And these binders hold volunteer tasks that needed documentation, and they're accessible for anyone when they need to perform a certain task. The binder also creates motivation and organization for volunteers, and communication between the staff and the volunteers becomes stronger. Operations overall improve by having larger donation capacity through more tasks being completed. But what's the key takeaway that I understood from this internship? There's two main ones that overall led into one big one. The new volunteer documentation system, which is the two binders, created clear task organization and communication, which increased operational efficiency. Plus, the visual and accessible training materials improve volunteer performance. And through my literature review, I found that visual aids really help certain people with finding things accessible, and it's easier for some communities to be able to learn through a visual picture or image or different colors, which is what I incorporated into the volunteer binder. And then both of these overall led into the structured documentation system, improving workflow and consistency, which then led into more reusable material collection and also moving materials away from our waste stream. The broader significance of my internship is that through Seattle Recreative's new volunteer documentation, donating and reusing unwanted materials will be more accessible. Organizations similar to Seattle Recreative can enhance their volunteer organization, which can lead to more people wanting to donate their unwanted materials rather than throw them away. Reuse will then also allow humanity to become more creative with their unwanted materials, and with more reuse and donation efforts, total generation of waste will decrease. And that's all for my presentation. I would like to acknowledge the Seattle Recreative team and the entire community of Seattle Recreative, as well as my faculty advisor and my friends and family for helping me accomplish this internship.